Good morning, everyone. Thanks very much for being here. I'm Lauren Brinjack, PRLA's Senior Director of Government Affairs. With us today is Michelle Elliott. Michelle is a regulatory analyst for the Independent Regulatory Review Commission, and she is here today to give us an overview of the regulatory review process in Pennsylvania. This process is quite a bit different from the legislative process, which many of you are probably much more familiar with. So we're happy to have Michelle here today to give us some background on how regulations work in Pennsylvania. Michelle, thanks very much for being here, and I am going to turn things over to you.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for being here today and for your interest in the regulatory review process. Today, as Lauren mentioned, I'm going to walk you through the regulatory review process. And I can't see the chat, but if you do have questions for me, would you mind just jotting them down, and then I'll try to answer them at the end, because there's a chance I might answer them as I go through. So, okay, so we can start through the slides. So in its simplest form, regulations go through a two-step process. There's a proposed stage and a final stage. And that is the one key piece of information that I hope you take home today. IRRC reviews and comments on an agency's proposed regulation and any accompanying comments from the public and the General Assembly. Then IRRC reviews and takes action on the final regulation before it is published in the Pennsylvania Bulletin and takes effect. And in case you're not familiar, the Pennsylvania Bulletin is a weekly publication of state government actions and notices. I want to take a moment to emphasize a point that I'll talk about later, and it's that the proposed stage is the most important part of the process, because an agency must respond to all comments submitted during the public comment period. So the proposed stage is when you, the public, have the best opportunity to impact the regulatory process. Okay, next slide. So let me give you a few facts about IRRC. As the name indicates, the Independent Regulatory Review Commission is an independent agency which oversees the regulatory review process. By law, we have 5 commissioners who are appointed by the governor, the Senate and House majority leaders, and the Senate and House minority leaders. And our current commissioners are Chairman George Bedwick, Vice Chairman John Meisner, Commissioners John Sirocco, Murray Effberg, and Dennis Watson. Our commissioners each serve a term of 3 years, except for the commissioner who is appointed by the governor. And the governor's appointee serves at the governor's pleasure. We'll discuss this later, but the role of our commissioners is ultimately to vote on whether to approve or disapprove a regulation. And that's their primary role in the regulatory review process. Next slide, please. Now let's talk just briefly about the history of IRRC. The Regulatory Review Act was not a law until 1982. So prior to that, there was no official legislative oversight. Most agencies had been given very broad authority to write regulations by the General Assembly. For example, the PUC, the Public Utility Code, includes the following provision: the commission may make such regulations not inconsistent with law as may be necessary or proper to exercise its powers for the performance of its duties. So it's very broad language. And agencies will often cite to this very general rulemaking authority when they promulgate a regulation. And because that language gives them great latitude for writing whatever regulations they want. Okay, next slide, please. If you were to look back at the legislative history of the Regulatory Review Act, you would find discussions about overregulation and unaccountable bureaucracy. Sponsors of the act noted that the General Assembly does not have the time to write every detail into law, nor do they have enough time to oversee all the details that the agencies were putting into their regulations. So there was no practical way for the General Assembly to assume primary oversight of the problem. So the next slide, please. The solution to this problem was the creation of a commission to provide full-time primary oversight designed to screen out excessive regulation and procedures from that which is reasonable and in the public interest. The thought was that the new commission would provide primary oversight, but the General Assembly would be vested with the ultimate responsibility for the review of regulations. And this is a key piece of information that I'll explain more in detail later. But the next slide, please. In 1982, the Regulatory Review Act became law. And the intent, as you can see here, was the intent of the act was to establish a method for ongoing and effective legislative review and oversight to foster executive branch accountability, provide for the primary review by an agency with sufficient authority, expertise, independence, and time to perform that function, provide ultimate review of regulations by the General Assembly, assist the governor, the attorney general, and the General Assembly in their supervisory and oversight functions, and encourage the resolution of objections to a regulation and the reaching of consensus among IRRC, the standing committees, interested parties, and agencies. Next slide. Prior to 1982, the Regulatory Review Act and the Regulatory Review Act, the first three laws listed on here on this slide governed the promulgation of regulations by state agencies. You'll see the administrative code there, which requires fiscal notes, and those are published in the Pennsylvania Bulletin. The second is the Commonwealth Attorneys Act, which provides for review by the Office of the Attorney General and the Office of General Counsel. The Office of the Attorney General reviews regulations before they are delivered to IRRC. And for final regulations, the Office of General Counsel reviews them before delivery. I'm sorry. Yes. So for final, OGC reviews them before delivery to IRRC, and the AG reviews them after IRRC has completed its review. The third listed there is the Commonwealth Documents Law, and that requires a proposed and final rulemaking stage, except in limited circumstances, and I'll mention those next. Next slide, please. So what exactly is a regulation? As defined in the Regulatory Review Act, a regulation is any rule or regulation promulgated by an agency under statutory authority, which can amend, revise, or otherwise alter the terms and provisions of an existing regulation. As I mentioned just a moment ago, through acts or statutes, the legislature gives agencies the power to promulgate regulations. Generally, when a final regulation is published in the Pennsylvania Bulletin, then that regulation has the full force and effect of law, and failure to comply may result in penalties. So once a regulation is effective, it is permanent and can only be undone by another regulation which would rescind it. On the next slide, we'll talk about what a regulation can do. Commonwealth agencies have the authority, discretion, and responsibility to promulgate regulations, and they do this for a variety of reasons. They might be repealing an existing regulation. There could be new legislation that requires that they promulgate a regulation. They may need to amend existing regulations to align them with federal or state statutes that have changed, or an agency might need to clarify an existing regulation. The next slide, please. This slide shows just the vast array of possible types of regulations. You'll see here, there's one addressing minimum wage, one addressing high school graduation requirements, and then that last one was one of the more interesting ones that we got to look at, and that is related to mixed martial arts. And that one allowed, in certain cases, the waiver of rules against striking to the head while on the ground, and required contestants to wear shin and instep pads. That was pretty controversial. Oh, next slide, yes. IRRC doesn't oversee every regulation in Pennsylvania. There are some exceptions. When the General Assembly drafted the Regulatory Review Act, they excluded the Senate, the House of Representatives, the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission, the Pennsylvania Game Commission, and any court, political subdivision, and municipality or local authority. So as it sees fit, when the legislature writes a law, they may specifically state that certain regulations are exempt from the Regulatory Review Act for a specific time period. You might have been reading about medical marijuana in the news lately. I know you've all heard of gaming in Pennsylvania. And those two sets of regulations were, the legislature gave them the authority to publish temporary regulations in order to implement these programs quickly. And then they do, there's usually a time period during which they must transition them then to permanent regulations. And that's actually where the medical marijuana regulations are right now. They're still temporary, about to expire at some point, and then so they're transitioning those to permanent regulations. Okay, on the next slide. There are several ways to find out about regulations that are being promulgated by an agency, and I'll talk a little bit more about each of these in the next slides, but each of the three bullets here, main bullets provided here, show different levels of details that you can, depending on your needs or interests. So if you have an interest in a specific proposed regulation or agency, then IRRC's website is a great resource. If you prefer to keep up to date on what all the state agencies are doing on a weekly basis, you can look at the Pennsylvania Bulletin. And if you would like a bigger picture view, you can look at the governor's regulatory agenda, which is published in the Pennsylvania Bulletin twice a year. On the next slide. And in case you've never heard of the governor's regulatory agenda or seen it, this is what it would look like if you pull it up in the Pennsylvania Bulletin. And as you can see here, there's a nice amount of information provided to the public, a contact person and the topic. And so this is a great way of keeping track of what regulations might be coming that you might be interested or that might affect your business. Okay, the next slide. Now this is just a snapshot of IRRC's homepage, and you'll see at the top, I have to acknowledge personally, I don't think it's all that user-friendly because the links aren't always obvious. So I'll point out a couple of the places where I personally think that, but at the top, those words are links, and you can use those to access information about our meetings. And this would include our meeting schedules, agendas, minutes from previous meetings, and also archived videos of those meetings. There's information about IRRC's commissioners and contact information for IRRC staff. There are documents provided such as our process manual, our regulations, because IRRC follows regulations as well, and our annual reports. There are also that little gray box with the search icon, that in that place you can search for regulations. Well, that would be by number, I'm sorry, under the word regulations. If you click on that, there would be a drop down, and there you can search more finitely, like by date or by keyword. And then you'll see also there's a subscription that's circled. I'm going to talk more about that because that's really useful to the public. And that would send you email notifications depending on your preferences. So on the next slide is how you would do IRRC subscriptions or submit to one. So depending on what you're interested in, you would receive notifications of things such as when our meeting agendas are posted, or if there's a new document posted for a specific regulation, or even if an agency submits a regulation at all to IRRC, you can be notified. And if you would click on the new document from agency selection, it'll take you to the next screen. And this slide, as you can see, allows you to drill down a little more to what specific types of information you want to be notified about. So you could concentrate on a specific regulation or agency that affects you or something you're interested in. And you can also choose what types of notification you would receive or when certain types of documents are posted. And that includes proposed and final regulations, comments from a committee, comments from the public, comments and orders from IRRC. So one thing to remember is that comments submitted on any particular regulation will be posted here on IRRC's website. On the next slide, you'll see just a snapshot of the Pennsylvania Bulletin. And in this example, the State Board of Veterinary Medicine was publishing a proposed rulemaking. And if you happen, if you're interested in that and clicked on it, then that would take you to the regulation. And the Pennsylvania Bulletin publishes both the proposed and the final regulations. And they also list any recent IRRC actions like upcoming meetings, recent IRRC comments on regulations, and on the next screen. Okay, so I've given you some background, and now we'll talk about the regulatory review process itself. So as I said at the beginning, it's a two-stage process, proposed and final. So now we'll talk about the proposed stage. On the next slide. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. That's the correct slide. Thank you. Each legislative session, the Speaker of the House and the President Pro Tem designate which state agencies each committee will oversee. So when I reference standing committees, that's what I'm referring to. And an agency delivers a proposed regulation to IRRC and its designated standing committees on the same day. The agency must include in its delivery a completed regulatory analysis form, which requires an agency to provide a wide range of information required under the Regulatory Review Act and under IRRC's own regulations, a summary of the regulation and the deadline for submittal of public comments. This is the public comment period that I may have referenced earlier, and I'll talk more about in a moment. Also, the agency obviously must provide the actual text of the proposed regulation, and we call that the annex. The proposed regulation is then published in the Pennsylvania Bulletin about 2 weeks later. Following the public comment period, which is 30 days or longer, IRRC has 30 days itself to review the regulation to determine if IRRC is going to comment on it. And the Regulatory Review Act requires that IRRC must submit its comments within 30 days of the close of the public comment period. We have no flexibility in that time frame. On the next slide. I mentioned the public comment period a moment ago. The Regulatory Review Act requires that the public comment period must be at least 30 days. During that time, the public, interested parties, and the regulated community have the opportunity to submit written comments on a proposed regulation. Comments from legislators and standing committees can be submitted at any time. All comments received by IRRC are scanned and placed on IRRC's website. As IRRC reviews a proposed regulation, we evaluate all public comments against our criteria, which I'll talk about in a moment. The regulated community is very important because they provide insight into how the proposed regulation may affect them, and that feedback makes Pennsylvania's process robust. Public comments are a crucial part of the regulatory review process, and more often than not, they do form the basis of IRRC's comments on a regulation. I would just like to reiterate the importance of public comments at the proposed stage. If a regulation is particularly meaningful to a group such as yours, that group may request a meeting with IRRC staff to explain their thoughts or provide insights into a particular issue. Similarly, IRRC will occasionally request a meeting with the promulgating agency to get a better understanding of the regulation. On the next slide, please. When IRRC reviews regulations, it uses the criteria listed in the next 2 slides. These criteria are found in the Regulatory Review Act. When we begin our evaluation, the first things we look at is whether the agency has the statutory authority to promulgate the regulation and whether it is consistent with the intent of the General Assembly. We look at the cited statutory authority the agency provides. We might also review the legislative history of the act on which the regulation is based. The remaining criteria are then used to determine if the regulation is in the public interest. Among other things, it includes fiscal impact, protection of the public health, reasonableness, and clarity. Next slide, please. When we issue our comments on a proposed rulemaking, we have to link any concerns that we have to the criteria contained in the Regulatory Review Act. If we don't comment on a particular provision of a rulemaking and the agency does not change it at final, then our commissioners are precluded from disapproving a regulation based on that provision. That is why it's so important for the regulated community to provide input to IRRC during the proposed rulemaking stage. It allows us to review the concerns of the public and possibly include them in our comments, and we refer to this as preserving our scope of review on the final regulation. Next slide, please. Before we talk about what happens between the proposed and final stages, I thought I'd take a moment to show you an example of what a regulation looks like if you would look it up on IRRC's website. So if you pulled up this particular regulation from the Department of Labor and Industry, you'd see the IRRC number highlighted in yellow there. I added those highlights to just point some things out. You'll see the title of the regulation. There's also the specific code and chapter that the agency is intending to change. And on the right, you'll see a whole list of dates, and those are all very important, such as the date it was delivered, the date that the public comment period closed, when the final was due by. And then on the next slide is actually just the bottom of the previous slide. It was too large. And here you'll see that if you would click on that proposed as highlighted in yellow, that's what will pull up. I'm sorry, if you click on the proposed, you'll see this screen. And then you could click on the download, and obviously you would get to download the proposed regulation. And here, and you can see on the right that all the names of anyone who commented is listed here. And there it is obvious that if you click on that name, you will pull up that comment. What might not be so obvious is that the final regulation and related documents there in that title bar, those are links. And so when the final would come back, you could click on that final regulation and you would see very similar information. If there were any comments submitted, they would be listed there. And also you would see the order providing IRRC's final decision on that regulation. Okay, on the next slide. This is what you would see if you did download the regulation from the previous screen. If you download it, you would pull up the entire regulatory package, which begins with this, the regulatory analysis form. And this is something that must be completed in its entirety by the agency. They're not permitted to put NA. They must provide a reason why it's not applicable. So it requires, it's about 18 pages. It requires a lot of information. Let's see, it includes a brief description of the regulation. There's, as you can see at the bottom there, they must provide their statutory authority. There's a requirement to provide the need for the regulation. They're required to share any outreach they did while they were drafting it, and fiscal impacts, and many other bits of information that were very interesting to anyone who's interested in the regulation. And that's all posted. So on the next page, this is just showing what the annex would look like if you would pull it up. And here, so the annex is the actual text of the regulation just being proposed. So in this one, you'll see, just to show you, if you're not familiar with editing, the bold and underline indicates that they're adding that provision. They're adding it, looks like a definition, because it's under definitions. They're adding a definition of general operation. And the little asterisks there indicate that there's text in between. So obviously there's a B, there was an A above it, a C after it, there's other words. So those are that just indicates there's other text that is not open for review. Okay, on the next slide. This is just another example from within that regulation showing how an agency would delete text. So you can see here that they're intending to delete consists of, and instead add in the word is and either, and then they're adding some subparagraphs and removing, so they're just capitalizing knowledge there. So just thought I'd point that out. On the next slide, this is what it looks like when you pull up the Pennsylvania Bulletin, and this is how the regulation would appear. And just a note that the Pennsylvania Bulletin does have the authority to make changes to the formatting of a proposed regulation. So if you're ever actually following a regulation and want to comment on it, the version that you would pull up on IRRC's website that was submitted by the agency is not the official version. you would always want to go to the Pennsylvania Bulletin and reference this one if you were going to comment on a particular provision and wanted to point out that subparagraph B, there's an issue with that. You want to use this version because that is the one that would, that's the official version. And then next slide, please. So after the close of the public comment period, an agency has 2 years to return a rulemaking to IRC and the committees for final review. And if it is not returned, it is deemed withdrawn. The typical turnaround time is about a year. As this slide indicates, the time between the proposed and final is when an agency can refine the regulation based on IRC's comments, the public comments, and any comments from standing committees. They can use this time to build consensus with the regulated community on any outstanding issues. It is also the time when an agency prepares its responses to all comments it received and amends the regulation if it so chooses. Sometimes an agency might decide not to return a regulation for final consideration, and this could happen for any number of reasons. Usually it's when an administration changes, or if there's a change to the law in the meantime, or if an agency just decides for some reason to change direction entirely, they might not bring it back. Okay, on the next slide. So this is a synopsis of how a final regulation is reviewed by IRC and the committees. So before it is officially delivered, it must be reviewed by the Office of General Counsel. And once a regulation is delivered, it is placed on IRC's agenda. The Regulatory Review Act prohibits IRC from acting on a regulation for 30 days. During this time, IRC staff will alert the committee staff that committee staff and anyone who commented on the proposed regulation about its delivery. During this stage of the process, committees can take formal action that includes approving the regulation, disapproving the regulation, or requesting additional time for review after IRC acts. Committees can take action at any time up to 24 hours before IRC acts on the regulation. If a committee does not take action, it is considered deemed approved by the committee. Most committees allow regulations to be deemed approved. A more common action is that the majority and/or minority chair of a committee would submit a letter expressing support or concern for regulation. On the next slide, shows that, again, a final regulation must include responses to all comments received on the proposed regulation. And the delivery must include an updated RAF and an annex formatted to show changes from proposed to final. And then when IRC reviews a final regulation, it can only consider provisions of the regulation that were commented on and any changes that the agency made between proposed and final would be open for IRC's review, as well as any issues that are raised by the committees of the final regulation. Next slide. You'll see how IRC considers a regulation at a public meeting. These meetings are open to the public. They're not hearings. People often think that, but they are not, so no one is sworn in. And public participation, as I tried to indicate all along, is a cornerstone of the regulatory review process. And our commissioners truly appreciate when people from the regulated community participate. For each regulation that is on the agenda, the following will happen. Staff provide a brief summary of the regulation and recent developments. The agency makes a statement. The public is given an opportunity to comment on the regulation. The agency then has the opportunity to respond to any public comments, and then the commissioners take action, either voting to approve or disapprove the regulation. It's important to note that IRC can only approve or disapprove a regulation in its entirety. We do not have line item veto power. So the commissioners are tasked with looking at the overall scope of the regulation and determining, is it in the public interest or not? Okay, on the next slide. So again, as I've said several times, public participation is the key to the regulatory review process. And commenters from the proposed rulemaking stage, as I mentioned, will be notified about delivery of the final by IRC staff. And if a commenter still has concerns at the final stage, it's important to relay them to IRRC and the agency as soon as possible. An important thing to remember at this point is that IRRC is required by the Regulatory Review Act to observe a 48-hour blackout period on comments received. So any comments received during that time will be embargoed and will not be read by the commissioners until the meeting is called to order. So we always encourage interested people to submit comments prior to that point. So you, the public, can attend an IRRC meeting and you can present your views to the commissioners, and they may ask you questions if they have anything, want to know something more about what you have to, your concerns or support. On the next slide. If IRRC approves a regulation and the committees have also approved or deemed it approved, the agency can proceed with the promulgation. The next steps would include a final review by the Attorney General for form and legality, and then delivery to the Legislative Reference Bureau for final publication in the Pennsylvania Bulletin. Once the regulation is published as a final rule, it is generally effective on that date, unless there is a language specifying a later effective date. On the next slide. In certain circumstances, a proposed regulation can be promulgated without being formally voted on by IRRC at a meeting. These regulations are considered to be deemed approved, and this happens when the following three things occur. First, IRRC did not issue comments on the proposed regulation. The agency did not make any changes between the proposed and final stages. And third, the committees did not raise any issues with the rulemaking. So under these circumstances, the agency must still deliver the final regulation to IRRC and the committees on the same day. And then the regulation would be placed on IRRC's meeting agenda, but instead of a vote, the chairman would just read a statement indicating that it has been deemed approved by law. Okay, on the next slide. Again, most regulations do become effective upon publication in the Pennsylvania Bulletin. And when that happens, that means that a regulation has successfully gone through the regulatory review process in Pennsylvania and has the full force and effect of law. Next slide, please. There are occasions when IRRC will disapprove a regulation. However, that is not necessarily the end of the road for an agency. They have to decide how they want to proceed. So after IRRC delivers its disapproval order to the agency, then the agency has 40 days to redeliver the regulation to IRRC with changes or without. They could also choose not to redeliver the regulation, and that would be the end of the road for that particular rulemaking. If an agency decides to redeliver, again with or without changes, IRRC will consider the rulemaking a second time. However, our time frame for review is shortened from 30 days to 15 days. And regardless of IRRC's second action, the rulemaking will automatically go to the standing committees for further review. Next slide. At the beginning of the presentation, I mentioned that IRRC was created to perform the primary review of regulations, but it is the General Assembly that has the ultimate responsibility to stop a regulation that is not in the public interest. That is why even 2 disapprovals by IRRC cannot stop an agency from promulgating a regulation. That must be done by the General Assembly through the concurrent resolution process. And I will note that it is very rare for IRRC to disapprove a regulation twice. Most agencies are able to build consensus with the regulated community, IRRC, and the standing committees. And as a general rule, agencies try very hard to get an approval. In instances where consensus cannot be reached, an agency will sometimes then just withdraw the regulation. Okay. Oh, right. So this slide represents what must happen for the General Assembly to bar a regulation. At this point, IRRC is no longer involved in the process. This process requires a designated standing committee to report out a concurrent resolution barring the regulation from being promulgated. After that, both chambers must also approve it. It is then sent to the governor for approval, and if the governor vetoes it, both chambers can override the veto by a 2/3 vote. If a standing committee or the General Assembly fails to take action within the prescribed timeframes, the agency can then proceed with promulgating the regulation. And just as a fact of interest, there have only been 15 concurrent resolutions reported out by the standing committees. So it doesn't happen very often. On the next slide, please. So I mentioned earlier that the Commonwealth Documents Law provides limited circumstances in which the proposed stage can be omitted. And one of those types is a final omitted regulation. And that can be used when comments are not appropriate, needed, or beneficial, such as for military affairs or agency management regulations, or when all persons subject to the regulation would be notified. And the state boards are a good example of that because they have a very finite regulated community, and they have the ability to contact all licensees. Also, if notice is simply impracticable, unnecessary, or contrary to the public interest. And examples of that are when there's a response to an emergency or regulations that rescind another regulation associated with repealed or amended statutes. In those cases, there's no need for public comment because there's nothing to comment about. Another type is emergency certified regulation. That can be considered a final or final omitted regulation. The Regulatory Review Act allows an agency to immediately implement the regulation where the governor or attorney general certifies that it is necessary to respond to an emergency. The emergency certified regulation takes effect upon publication in the Pennsylvania Bulletin or on a date specified by the agency's adoption order. Although IRRC and the standing committees review the regulation in the same manner as other final regulations, the regulation takes effect prior to the completion of the review process. The next slide. So as I mentioned, neither of these types of regulations are published in the Pennsylvania Bulletin because they're not proposed. They don't go through the proposed stage. So they would enter the regulatory review process at the final stage. So even though there is no formal public comment period, comments from the public and the legislature are still welcome. And IRRC does not issue comments on these. Instead, IRRC simply acts on them at the next public meeting, which occurs no less than 30 days after delivery. On the next slide. So in closing, these are just a few more ways to stay informed about Pennsylvania's regulatory review process. And there's our Twitter account for anyone who uses that. Also, recordings of IRRC's meetings, as I mentioned earlier, are posted on our website and can be found by searching IRRC PA on Vimeo. And also, as mentioned earlier, I just want to again highlight our email subscription service allows you to receive lots of types of notifications based on your preferences. And then finally, on our website, again, I touched on a few of these. You can find the Regulatory Review Act. You can find IRRC's regulations. You can find the Commonwealth Documents Law, IRRC's brochure, and a full list of commissioners and staff. So I greatly appreciate your interest in the regulatory review process, and thank you for your attention today. And I will try to answer any questions if you have them.
Michelle, we do have a couple of questions in the chat. Some of them I think that you have probably covered as you progress through your presentation, but I'll summarize some of them here. Who prepares the IRRC report? Is that IRRC with the department or agency requesting the change, or just the agency?
Okay, what is, I need a little clarity on what is the IRRC report? Is that a reference to the comments, the package?
I'm thinking probably the regulatory analysis document.
Okay, that REF that provides, that comes from the agency. So, and then we thoroughly review that, and the public is encouraged to thoroughly review that as well, because specifically like fiscal impacts, you know, IRRC staff, we have the knowledge that we have. We are not all knowing about every agency and every regulated community out there. So that is why when we receive a proposed regulation, we do our best to do extensive outreach to notify as many people as we think might be affected by it. And we rely on individuals and agents, associations such as PRLA to let us know, hey, we're reviewing this and these fiscal impacts seem off, or, nobody reached out to us, for input on drafting. And those are things that the agency would have to respond to then, because we would very likely comment on that and ask them for more information. And then they do, again, have to amend that and submit an updated version on the final. So I hope that answers the question.
Thanks. And then we have another, it says, Michelle, you had mentioned the IRRC process. In the IRRC process, the agency's legislative authority is checked as part of your review process. Does this mean only a lawsuit can undo a regulation, or does IRRC have a process to withdraw its approval?
Oh, no. IRRC can only approve or disapprove, and whatever happens afterwards is out of our hands. But yes, I believe a lawsuit would be, if the General Assembly doesn't stop a regulation, then yeah, there have been lawsuits. I think you've probably seen some in the news about Reggie's, for example, was a really big one that I think there's pending legal scenarios going on there. But yes, IRRC has very limited power, and it's really not even power. I mean, we just approve or disapprove. So.
And I think that's it's about all we have as far as questions. If anyone else has any questions.
Hey, good morning, Michelle. This is Zach Pizek with the PRLA. I just wanted to chime in and say thank you very much for walking through this process. This was a terrific presentation. And as you can imagine, we've had so many questions from our members, especially as it relates specifically to the recent regulatory changes around the Minimum Wage Act, the tip minimum wage here in PA. I had a few questions that I've gotten from members in the past that I wanted to kind of throw your way. One was, I've heard from, and I think you went into this a little bit, but I'm curious the specifics. How often would you say regulations are changed due to comments from the public, and between that proposed rulemaking and final rulemaking process?
Oh, that's easy to answer. I would say virtually every time. So not every time a comment comes in. So if we get comments that are outside the scope of our criteria, and I can't think of, a lot of times comments might come in, say on nursing homes, it's such a broad thing. And, someone anyway, if the comment comes in and it's not germane to our criteria, then that would not be used. I mean, we review every comment, but we have to look for that criteria is very limited and focused. So a lot of times public comments might be outside the scope of our review, but the agency still must respond to that comment, even if it's, about something unrelated in our scope, they must respond. And but back to your point that any comments that we receive from the public that are relevant to our criteria, such as clarity or fiscal impacts or need, if we see that, we would most of the time include that in the scope of our comments. We would embed that within it or touch on it. And then, yeah, an agency, they have to reply. My most familiar example is like sometimes, EQB, DEP, they do really complicated, regulations. And occasionally I've seen in there, if there's a particular provision that people were upset about and we comment on it, they might sometimes say like, we received this comment, but we defer, or I'm trying to think of the language they'll use, but they'll say, we disagree. And sometimes that's all they'll say. I mean, there's no requirement. They just need to acknowledge every comment. But I feel like the percent of times that the agencies generally are very sincere. It seems to us, they want an IRRC approval. We're all seeking consensus. And so they seem to make a very good effort, good faith effort at amending the regulation, or at least finding a middle ground. You're never going to please everyone, but.
And how often would you say, Michelle, the rule is mitigated upon the Attorney General's review? of the, and is the Attorney General really just looking, is that office really just looking at it in terms of the legal merits? Or are they also looking for clarity and at the other details that you guys are looking at as well?
All I can comment on that is that they are looking at for form and legality, and from what and we really don't know a lot. We occasionally find out that they had a concern and went back to the agency, and something will be done behind the scenes of IRRC, like, a change might be made, or maybe the agency explained and the Attorney General said, okay, but that's outside of what happens in our agency. So I don't have any hard information on that. I just know that occasionally there is some back and forth to get something straightened out.
Thanks, Michelle. And we had another question come into the chat. What is the typical background of one of the appointed IRRC commissioners?
Yeah, this is an interesting time in IRRC history. There is no requirement, so it has varied greatly, and I couldn't even tell you back in history, but currently 4 of our commissioners are attorneys. So it is a very interesting time, that their backgrounds are all similar, and they're familiar with the law. So we've had some interesting meetings.
Well, if there aren't any further questions, Michelle, thanks so much for being here. We are going to send a link to this recording out to everyone who has registered for the webinar. If anyone has any additional questions, please feel free to contact myself or contact Zach, and we'll be in touch with Michelle and see if we can get some answers to your questions, should you think of any in the meantime. But thanks so much, everyone, for being here, and thanks, Michelle, for all of the very helpful information.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you.